So little room. Yeah. I'm glad I'm sitting down there.
Yeah, that's big.
But that doesn't work.
No, it's also still black. So maybe we should ask the AV person. Still, because also the screen is not. Right here.
Okay.
Close. Tim. Instructions by the meeting here.
So meet Thanks, fine Meet Echo people. Excellent. I think the last session of Tuesday, this is Dnsop. We have 5 minutes?
2 minutes.
Oh, we have 2 minutes. Okay, never mind. Always ahead. Sorry.
Oh, 10 after. Oh, sorry. Yeah,
no, we're 3 minutes late.
I'm wrong. Yeah.
You slackers. So we are 3 minutes late.
Yeah, I'm wrong.
Welcome to Dnsop, the last meeting for Tuesday. I am Tim. That's Benno. And that's Suzanne down at the other end. Warren's over there. He's our area director. Paul's doing minutes. Hi, Paul. Poor Dan York didn't make it. So Tim, where is Tim? I don't see Tim. The other. Okay. I need my glasses. There we go. Thanks. He's going to be doing JavaScribe. So the note well, please note it. Details, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know what's going on there. So this is session 1, but there's blue sheets going around. So please fill them in. The room will be smaller next time, which right now doesn't look too bad. So it looks kind of sad and empty. So our agenda today, it's an hour and a half, I think. Mostly updates on some old work, the hackathon updates, and some current working group business. There's only like 3 or 4 different talks. Since our last meeting, it's been kind of sad. Guess we haven't had a great fall. Capture format finally got done. Obsolete DLV is in the editor queue. And I tell you, for moving something historic, that's a lot of work. You know, Warren and I actually spent way too much energy on that. So when they say the output of the IETF is documents, it's a one direction thing. So I do think we somehow need to fix that. The poor camel was suffering on that one. So, but that should be done soon. We've got 2 things in the ISG queue: serve stale, which looks like Barry released this morning, and the no response issue, which I pushed out. We have 2 write-ups going on, and I am committing. I had to apologize to Benno like 3 times yesterday because I want 2845 biz done this week. We're going to push that along. And so that's our commitment to you, that we'll have that Shepherd write-up done. And probably 7606 biz, there was that one update that I believe the authors did. And as long as that addresses it, we'll do the same there. So hopefully by the end of the week, Friday, that'll be all moving along, because we have 2 things. Oh, we have extended error, which is coming up today. That's good times. The multi-provider DNSSEC, we need some comments from folks. So we've heard a few things, but we should get some emails from folks to say whether they want to move it through working group last call or not. We believe it's a good, solid document. We just need to hear some more stuff. So either way kind of thing. Please, folks, send some emails, do something. Maybe the authors can leverage their goodwill on people. And ready for working group last call. And we've been sitting on these mostly because we've been trying to get the other documents done, and they just don't want to go as fast as we want them to. The Zone Digest document, with which Dwayne will talk about briefly, and the TCP requirements that he's going to talk about briefly on Thursday. And we don't think they need a lot, but we've been really just trying to get that backlog going so we can start pushing these out, because we got stuff going on. And we finally adopted that Yang document. The chairs wanted to send it to the ops area, and then Warren said, well, that's where drafts go to die. And I was like, that's what I thought Dnsop was for. So we were kind of confused by that. So, but it's only going to sit there until the ISG kind of figures out this whole Yang problem. So that's probably the most simple way of putting it. So we've got a couple other documents that we're not going to talk about. The 7816 biz, which expired. That's kind of sad. So we'll have to find Stefan and see what's going on there. The A-name document, it's actually going to be discussed. What's that? Did I get that wrong? Oh, is that in DPRIVE? No, it's not. I didn't know. That's 70.
Paul Hoffman, co-author on 7816 bis. I've been waiting on the working group chairs to say whether you want us to be moving it forwards or not.
Oh,
I've sent
my
two
bad.
messages over the last 6 months because we're ready to revive it.
I apologize.
Okay.
Usually,
Yeah. No, we were waiting on you. You had said, last time you had said we've got a lot going on, and
yeah.
For those who don't know, 7816 bis is
QNAME.
QNAME minimization, and the BIS will be both to possibly put on standards track, but to mostly to show what has been found out, in deployments, and we've got some interesting research articles and such like that. So last I heard, you were waiting until things sort of settled down here because we weren't in a rush. We're happy to start, and Ralph said that he would co-author. We're ready to do it. Do you want us to go ahead?
Yeah, I figured
Okay.
you should yell at your chairs a little bit more. No, we missed that.
No.
Yeah. Okay, never mind. The A-name draft, there's actually part of the discussion on Ben and Eric's draft actually sort of covers some stuff in there. There's some interesting stuff, some good slides in there. These we aren't actually going to really cover. The terminology TER, and we figure some stuff's going to come up from that ABCD BOF that happened earlier today and some other stuff. So who knows, probably by the next meeting we'll be in shape to do something. And the resolver information, people seem to be implementing it, but they're just not talking about it. So those which cannot be named. But there's actually DPRIVE documents that seem to be referencing it. So that's why I was kind of wondering where that status was. So that's kind of else. And the rest of the stuff's going to be talked about either today or Thursday. Most of it's all today. And that's, in the data tracker or on our GitHub. We haven't adopted a bunch. We haven't seen a lot that people seem to be sort of thrilled on. That may change after the BOF this afternoon. So Benno's going to talk hackathon updates. and then I think we'll kick over to Dwayne and sort of take it from there. And I'm good. I think I can go sit down because there's no room up here. So, so thanks all.
Thank you.
Yep.
There we go. There we are. One moment. It's more practical. Well, this IETF, this hackathon, as usual, a group of DNS software engineers gathered around the table. And also, as usual, other than other groups, actually, we didn't have a plan. One single plan, we had a number of plans. So each software developer worked on an ID. And most of these IDs are directly relevant to Dnsop working group or deprive working group. So if we consider the number of themes was DNS privacy, protocol improvement, service provisioning, HTTPS SVC, and DNS monitoring, which is not directly Dnsop working group related, but good work anyways, and worth mentioning. Good. On the DNS privacy theme, Manu Brité worked on DNS over TLS to authoritative. So it was kind of, how could that work? Eh? How can we make that work that from a recursor to an authoritative? So we worked on a set of net blocks, specifying a kind of whitelist of set of net blocks that are DOT enabled, including a host name for verification. So you can specify ABC 0/24, and then DOT is mandatory. How to come to bootstrap this list, that's something the deprive working group has to work upon. So this is not solved. So, but at least this could be a way to implement it once this discovery has been specified. DNS over HTTPS design in bind 9. So recently all the network code has been refactored out of the DNS, separated from the DNS code in bind 9. So, and with this new design, the new network design, DOH can be easily or more easily fitted in bind 9. So Andre worked on that, and about timelines, I'm not sure, somewhere early next year. DNS over HTTP 3, quick. Benny Innocenti worked on a proof of concept implementation based on the Cloudflare quiche library. It's also work in progress. It's good results here. DNS protocol improvement. Willem worked on it together with Andre. And it was interesting. It's kind of finalizing the draft, but also testing IDs. So if the draft, if we specify it this way, can we implement it? And is it performance? So there was an interesting hands and forth between specification and implementation. And so that was very worthwhile. Willem will tell more about this later. Extended error. The draft will also be presented later. There was already some code in Unbound. And Tim Wattenberg and Logodon, he worked on, an update in the code according to the latest draft. Also work in progress, was not completed yet during the hackathon. DNS service provisioning. So Rolf Dolmans worked on an update of his implementation. In the last hackathon, in Montreal, Rolf implemented the HTTP SVC. The draft has been updated. So Rolf also updated the implementation Unbound, including the SVCB records. Not everybody has tested, but there are some similarities. So it's good work here going on. And there will be some feedback to the document, specifically for the implementation details. DNS monitoring. Paul Hoffman and Willem Thor worked together on a tool. So the project is about, the project is more than only this tool, but the project is about the kind of the performance indicators of the root system. And that they have to be 100%. So one of the things is They want to test the DNS responses from the past. So validating a root zone, you have something like valid DNS or LDNS verify zone, but that's the zone file. It's not the response from a name server. So Willem and Paul worked together to build a tool to do some, to store queries from the past, or to store queries for later do the chain validation, the DNSSEC validation of answers. So, do I summarize it correctly? Thank you. Good. Code is on the GitHub Hackathon website. That's it. These are the hackers. My name is also between that. You might notice that I was not associated with any of the projects. That's correct. I'm just a talking head here. Exactly, I brought the coffee. Also important. That's it. Maybe some questions, follow-ups. Otherwise, go directly to the hackers, to the software developers for more questions. That's it. That's my part. Okay. I think Dwayne is next up. But just as a really wrap up. Oh, sorry. It seems it's really useful, this hackathon. And we see we make quite some progress during this interaction with a group of people, 2 days around the table and discuss ideas. It's not only coding, it's also a lot of talking about good ideas and how to go forward. Okay, thanks. I will pull up your slide. Oh no, we don't have. Yeah.
Tim said he made one.
We should have a placeholder.
Yeah. I think Tim said he made one.
Yeah, let's see. I think this one. This one.
All right. So I'm Dwayne. This is just a few minutes about the status of the message digest for DNS zones draft. So for a while now, this draft has supported the idea of algorithm agility. This is a change from the very earlier versions. So now there is the idea of having multiple zone MD records in the zone. After that change was published, there was some good feedback from a couple of people who pointed out some issues with sort of forward and backward compatibility. So an important change in the very last version is that the digest type field and the formerly called the reserved field, now called the parameter field, sort of the interpretations of those has changed. Previously, their interpretations were independent from each other, but in the current version, the meaning of the parameter field depends on the digest field. So please take a look at that. That's an important change. The current draft says that you must not have multiple digests with the same type and parameter. So that this is kind of designed to keep the size of the R set small and keep the reason for having multiple zone digests only for supporting algorithm rollovers. The name of the document defines one digest type, which formerly was just called SHA-384. Now it's called SHA-384-stable, and there was a very brief discussion about whether stable is a good name and maybe something else would be better, such as flat, and I'm supportive of that. I think that's maybe a better choice. There are currently 2 interoperable implementations of the zone digest, so that's very cool, and we think it's ready for working group last call. And I would also like to ask the working group if so previously there was a little bit of, I think, reluctance on the working group's part to adopt it as proposed standard, so it's currently marked as experimental, and I would like to ask if people have maybe changed how they feel about that and if we could consider going back to proposed standard. So thank you.
Yeah,
that's the update.
Just to go a little bit more into what that means as far as the intended status, there's a section in the document now that describes what's experimental about the proposed deployment, and I think that the question that we really have to consider is whether people are comfortable that it's deployable as written, at scale, or the suggestions, the issues called out in the section about the experiment, which is, I believe, section 5. You kind of have to figure out do we need more, the experiment that's described in order to determine whether this is deployable at scale and should be proposed standard, or if there's enough in the document now that people are confident it can be deployed as is.
Yeah, one of the experiment that is described there sort of relates to this issue of the meaning of the parameter field and the digest type. And personally, I feel that now that those have been sort of combined differently, it makes it a little easier to understand, to consider that it could be a proposed standard, and less reasons for it to be experimental. Time for questions? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're good on
Okay.
time.
Okay.
So questions,
Questions
comments,
or concerns?
opinions about
Yeah.
status, any of those things?
All right.
I guess I have, this is John Levine. I have sort of a dumb question. I mean, I looked at this and I don't understand why, what looks hard to deploy about it. Like you sort the zone and you sum it up.
So a lot of the discussion earlier on was about how you would support large dynamic zones with something like this. And so that's also the nature of the experiment. So if you sort of restrict this right now to smaller or stable zones, it's quite easy to deploy.
Yeah.
The complexity comes from the other. And so
For me, the obvious use case is downloading the root zone and making sure and validating the glue. You know, so I think even for assigning a static zone that isn't necessarily super huge. I mean, I think the use cases are already really obvious.
yes.
You know, so please move it ahead.
Okay, thanks. So, but John, does that mean you would support proposed standard or keep it experimental? Do you have an opinion on that?
I would, yeah.
You can think about it later.
Let me see if I can get coherent phonemes. Yes, I think as it is with the one, you know, flat, and I don't care what we call it.
Flat, stable, whatever.
I think the existing signing thing is technically simple enough that it makes sense to be proposed standard. And if people want to do experiments with funky trees for updates, like that can be an experiment. And I guess I will defer to the to management whether that needs to be like this is, say this is an experiment, or carve it off into a separate document, or more likely just like do the experiment and come back and say, hey, this way of signing updates seems to work.
Okay, thanks.
Alex Merver. One simple question. What are the two implementations that you did?
Can you say it again?
What are the two interoperable implementations that you did?
So one implementation is by myself using LDNS, so it's in C. The other implementation was done by Shane Kerr at a hackathon in Python.
Okay, cool. And to the question of experimental or standard track, I believe we can perfectly run this as experimental for now. And if it proves to be successful, why not rehash it in a BIS version and then add the experience from the deployment into it, like we did with QNAME minimization.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other suggestions? Questions? No? Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
You have some?
Okay.
Yeah.
It seems to me that unless there's strong support for putting this out as experimental, PS makes sense, just because experimental is kind of a commitment to come back later and reevaluate. And if folks don't feel that's necessary, I'm not sure we should commit to the future work.
Well, I'll be a little bit, I guess, more talk more about my rationale for wanting to do it, because, as John said, I see this being very useful for the root zone, and I would like to see it deployed there. And I think that as a proposed standard, it has more chance of getting to that point, whereas people may be reluctant to put something experimental, on the root zone. So
Our area director appears to want to be having
Yeah, this is the area director with no hats on. Especially where it's a great hat though. So if it's experimental, it's likely that we're going to try and explain what the experiment is and what the success and failure criteria are. And I'm not really sure what we would say other than, so that would be helpful if people tell us.
So,
Yeah, there is a section in the, there is a current, there is a brief section in the current document that, if we, that's another reason to lean towards saying what's there is clear enough that it's implementable now, because we would have to satisfy our area director that we had described the experiment in adequate detail.
So yeah, chair head off, and Nalnet Labs head on. So and Nalnet Labs is also planning to implement MD zone, Mrs. Dijk's zones, and also in response of Alex's remark, that there are two kind of experimental implementations maybe, but we are planning to do it in production code somewhere next year. So that's my contribution for now on the discussion. Yeah. But we are planning to do that in production code also.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. There you are. Sufficient time?
Oh, we're good on time.
We're good on time. So.
But if we go really fast, we can go to the social. Okay. I'm Wes Hardiker. I was going to talk today about the extended error conclusions and some non-conclusions from the working group last call number 2. I will say, well, there's a bunch of other authors. I should have listed them, and I didn't. My apologies to all of them. The good news out of all of this is that people seem to really care. And, they want it to be correct and right and perfect, which is a good thing, because sometimes drafts, people don't care about them and there's no comments, and that's not necessarily better. So first off, I'm going to talk about some conclusions that I don't think need help. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm going to talk about some conclusions that weren't really quite conclusions and brought up more questions than anything else. So the conclusion that I think was fairly easily resolved was registry changes. Previously there was 3 different sections of the registry, and we've removed that and changed it to just this. About the simplest, there's 65,280 entries. So we allocated the first most of the first ones, the first 49,152 technically, as first come, first serve. If anybody has a beef for this versus requiring technical expert or anything like that, but there's so many entries, it doesn't seem necessary to require expert review or anything out of a higher strain. And then the last one, there's a bunch of people, a few people that said they still wanted a private use space. Going once? Going twice? All right, so that was the end of the easy ones. So now there's 2 sort of major issues that came up after that, and they were worth discussing enough to bring here today as opposed to trying to resolve them on a mailing list. And so the first is, what do we do about UDP overflow issues? So overflow happens all the time, especially with things like glue. And the normal thing that we do is we set the TC bit, the truncated bit, in order to say, hey, some important information has been excluded. You may want to come back and retry over TCP so you can get the rest of this important information that I'm leaving out. Well, extended errors, of course, being sort of arbitrary in size, could of course cause overflow as well. So one of the important revelations is we didn't specify anything to do in the document, and clearly it's less important than some of those other things like glue. So we proposed putting in information saying we should just drop anything, but then it kind of comes to the question of, well, do you set the TC bit? So if there is EDE information that gets dropped, should that require setting the TC bit? So there's sort of some problems with that. One, setting the TC bit seems rather extreme. That's kind of like, EDE is really only supplemental information. And retrying over TCP just to get some extra supplemental information seems kind of extreme as well. And the EDE information that got dropped may be UDP specific. So when you request over TCP, you could actually get the exact same answer because the error actually went away because you went to a different protocol. So a new idea was floated on the list from Victor Duchovny's colleague, which would be an interesting thing to put in the acknowledgements section. That a new, he never said who it was, but we'd have to find out if we go this route, that a new EDNS0 bit might be used to say that instead of the TC bit, that would basically say, we've left out some non-essential diagnostic information, which sort of gives you a better hint of how much you actually care to go retrieve that. You know, if you're actually trying to debug stuff, you might actually want to call a tool that says, yes, I really want to go back and refetch that over TCP or something, so that you can figure out whether to debug it or not. So here's the options going forward, and this is where I think we need feedback. We could don't specify anything. Clearly that was wrong, and I think nobody wants that option, so I already crossed it out. We need to drop EDEs first, right? I think everybody agrees it's probably the least important information at this point. The question comes, do we set the TC bit? Do we don't set the TC bit and just leave it as is? Or do we create a new bit that says supplemental information was dropped? I'm sort of on the fence. I would love lots of opinions of what other people, especially implementers that actually want to deal with this and do stuff based on it. Excellent.
Ray Bellis-Icey. Wes, can you expand on the possibilities of how an ED could actually cause overflow? Because a minimal error response would normally only have the have the question section in it anyway, which doesn't leave
Ray, could you repeat it? I missed a couple of words in the echo.
A minimal error response only needs to have the question section in it for matching up with the original query. So
remember, I got it. So thank you. Remember that these can be included with any sort of response, and that even includes no error responses. In fact, I think there's some examples of that in the draft of when you might. So you're right that it might be unusual for this to actually occur in the wild, but it's still absolutely possible.
So it's the extended non-error responses that are the problem.
Extended non-error responses, yes, exactly. Mike.
Hi, Mike St. John's. You said something interesting where the data retrieved on TCP might not be the same data that you would have gotten under UDP.
No, the error. Okay.
The error response.
Right.
And that means that if you set any bit, there's no reason to go to TCP because all you're going to get, you may not get what you were trying to get.
Right.
So you need either to make that data the same or carry it over and say, well, this is what you would have gotten if you'd done this in UDP and we're just keeping it for TCP. So be aware that I like the last one, creating a new bit, but if you go back and ask the question, you need to get the information you would have gotten had you been able to stuff it all in.
I doubt implementations would be willing to figure out how to do that properly, but I understand your point.
Then you may want to just sort of drop this and not do it.
Well, that's one option, right? We'll just switch back and forth between microphones.
Hi, this is Andre IC. So from the implementer's point, don't do anything special. So TCP is perfectly fine because it will happen only in 1 of million, and switching to TCP is the thing we are going to do anyway. So just set the TCP if it doesn't fit. Don't care about the error that is not in the TCP, that's fine, the resolver will handle it. But the resolver code will not handle yet another option and yet another different handling. So please don't treat it any specially. Just use the normal code path for it. So if it doesn't fit, just drop the cut out from the bottom to the top until it fits, set the TC bit, and let the resolvers handle it.
Okay, great. I was expecting somebody with that opinion. So
and I'll say welcome what Andre said.
All right, 2.
Yeah, Eric Orth, Chrome DNS. I want to express support for the creating a new bit option just because I can see lots of cases where you're doing some debugging app and you're going to want to get that extra info if it was dropped. But in the case of Chrome, I don't think we're going to want to make another request to get it. It's good enough without the error info. We're not going to want to make another round trip to do that. So I think there's cases where you want to get it or you don't want to get it, and the new bit's the way to do that.
Okay.
relaying for Peter Spacek. TC equals 1 in case where EDE overflow seems excessive. So I would say drop EDE, do not set TC equals 1. New EDNS bit seems to be out of scope and should be specified in a separate document later. And Ted Lemon also, bits are expensive.
Did you say bits are expensive? Okay. Robert.
Robert Story, ISI. I'm going to say the opposite of what everybody else is saying. And you didn't consider leaving EDE and maybe shortening the glue records. Because people already know if you set, you're going to set truncation if you don't have enough glue, but you only have the EDE if it was specifically requested. So they asked for an EDE response. So throwing it away and keeping to fit in some extra glue records, it seems like they want the error message. You set the TC. If they want more of the glue records, they can retry with TC.
So I'm unless my recollection's wrong, there is no bit indicating I want it. You just get it. There was at one point. I think we removed that. So now EDEs can be included regardless of whether people said they wanted it.
Okay.
Brian?
Brian Dixon, GoDaddy. What if you set the TC bit and also created a new bit? So anything that was old and backward compatible would just do the TC thing. Something that was newer would decide based on that bit what it should do. Or is that too complex?
No, that's actually a good. That's a good secondary. So the new bit would indicate the TC is actually not that important.
Mike St. John's again.
Yep.
My thinking about this, going back, the TC bit implies that I left something out, and if you ask me again over TCP, you will get what I left out. So if this doesn't meet that syntax, you really should avoid redefining it.
Well, so be careful there, right? Because the TC bit is a hint that you should retry over TCP, and hopefully you will get everything. Because the DNS is a flexible system, there's no guarantee that when you ask again that something won't have changed. So it's not a guarantee at all. It's a strong indication.
It's an implication that, yeah, you should try. But okay.
Yeah, please, more opinions would be good because we're at a draw.
This is
right now.
Andre again. So I just want to support what you said, Wes, because when you send a query via UDP, you might hit a different server in a cloud or any cast. And then when you connect with TCP, you might be hitting a completely different server that will give you a completely different answer. So the state between the UDP and TCP never existed in DNS, and it should not be introduced, especially not in this minor draft.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point too. Okay, so I'm going to ask the chairs to call consensus. All right. I think we'll let that sit, and I'll send a message to the list and see if we can do a consensus on there, and maybe people sitting on it for a little bit will have an effect.
Yeah, indeed. We get a good sense from the room. Now we should probe the mailing list, indeed.
Okay.
And then.
And thanks for option 4.
And,
that was a good one.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, set 2 bits. All right. Last option, and the harder one. Multiple last call comments said, you know what, we really need to handle the forwarding case. So if people remember previously in the document, we said it was a undefined situation as to what to do when an ED occurred, say at a resolver that got it from an authoritative server or an upstream resolver, and how to pass it back to the client or something, in a longer chain that we all know and love in the DNS world. So discussions with a couple of people led to a series of options. So I'm going to list them all here, some of which I've already struck out because they don't seem wise, but they're all listed for completeness. One, we could mandate that no forwarding happens. You just drop it all on the floor. I don't think anybody wants to do that, and I think the comments on the list clearly indicated that. We could mandate that resolver and forwarder simply copy it forward. So you just, if you're generating more stuff back to the client, then you just, copy it all in and off you go. Note that resolvers may have been talking to more than one upstream. You may have been talking to more than one authoritative server that may have given you some EDE options that you may want to pass them all back to the client, which makes it kind of hard to figure out for the client, where did all this stuff come from? You could just copy and adjust the extra text field. So you add an extra bit of information to the front of it saying, hey, I was talking to somebody else. They gave me this error. I'm going to augment it saying where I got it from. This doesn't seem like the most wise thing to do because you're modifying somebody else's information. And we'll get back to formatting in a little bit. So options 4 to 7. 4, you could add some tracing elements to the packet. In other words, you could add elements to say where this came from so that you can trace it along. And there was even some discussions of doing some sort of like trace route mechanism where you are actually adding multiple hops so that you keep growing it so that you could actually trace it all the way down. As useful as that is, I think that the implementation complexity would make most implementers throw it out the window. We could recommend adding source indication like with another EDE supplemental flag that you would add after the other one and say, well, I got this previous one from this other guy. And that actually would require sorting. That's why number 5 is crossed out, because there is no requirement right now that resource records be sorted. And I really don't think we want to insert that requirement. In fact, some implementers said, no, I wouldn't do that, of course. Number 6, we could make the document experimental. That was suggested on the list as just get more deployment exercise and come deal with it later. And number 7 is your idea here, which Brian will fill us in on in a minute. Give me 1 minute, Brian. So number 4.1, I think, is where external consensus before this discussion has sort of come to a conclusion that adding a single source to the EDE generating, by the EDE generating entity, and then passing that on. So in other words, this is sort of the new proposed packet format. And so you can see that there's a new flag on the bottom right. There's a source length and a source field that gets added, and then some indication of source, and we'll get into that in the second part of this discussion, of this was generated by me, by some definition of me, and we'll get to that in a minute. But Brian, go ahead.
I was going to insert my idea here saying 4.1 with an identity for, this is going to be coming from another thing if the ADD working group or ABCD working group actually forms, something I was going to hope to work on there. Effectively locally generated, globally unique, but locally scoped name to be usable within a forwarding chain that would let you, if it's an upgraded resolver, actually do like a TCP or a DNS trace route, or at a minimum have the ability to generate an identity that is useful for that.
So that is the hard thing to do when you start thinking about identities. And in some of the before discussions, we came up with all of these crazy notions of, well, it could be on a private address space network. It could be that you pulled it over a URL, so you should include something that can do HTTPS in the identity field. And now you're passing it back over DNS. I mean, there's all these crazy sort of notions of DNS has no notion of how you got the packet and that it must be the same protocol all the way through. So the identity section, we're going to get to that in a minute, which is, here's the list of identities that we could possibly stick in the source field. But for now, I want to stick with, is 4.1 a single identity the right answer, or would somebody prefer some of the other ones? We'll get into naming the identities in a second. Is that fair?
My vote is for 4.1. It's the right thing.
Excellent. Perfect.
Ray Bellis, ISC. My vote is none of the above, please. Just don't. eDNS semantics are supposed to be hop by hop, and this is a massive extension to those semantics.
Yes. So would your proposal would be drop it on the floor?
The drop it on the floor is the default at the moment, and we know that we're not good in DNS to kind of upgrade stuff. So unless all the kind of forwarders in the past implement that, then, well, we'll drop it on the floor anyway. And if the forwarders implement it, I think they can make an informed decision to give back the correct error. I mean, that would be implementation saying, okay, I got this error and maybe got it from somewhere. The somewhere might actually not be reachable for you because of forwarding change in private space.
Okay, so if you're both saying the same thing, basically it should be the middle box that is actually handling the original one to make an intelligent determination of what to do with it, whether to refactor it and create a new one and pass it on to a client. Is that correct?
Yeah, more or less, but with the caveat that what we call a middle box depends on whether you're talking about a dumb, home gateway type proxy forwarder, which just is essentially almost nothing more than a NAT, versus something that's actually intelligently sat in the path of the DNS query.
Okay, so if you don't know what to do with it because you're not, you're seeing new codes or something, just drop them and don't add to it. Okay, this side first, please.
Ben Schwartz. I don't like this for a different reason. So I also am somebody who's kind of intrigued by the idea of a DNS traceroute, but I think that there's an efficiency concern here where potentially an upstream resolver might have a good reason. Actually, the more information it can include, the better the more useful it can be for debugging, the more it can help whatever the next hop is. But because there's no signal here in the query that requests this information, there's essentially no choice but to do this all the time. And so we're proposing to essentially include potentially a very large amount of information in every single response packet. If I imagine, for example, including entire DOE URI templates of every hop in the request path in every single response, I think it's very inefficient and not very useful.
Okay, so drop it on the floor and don't pass anything forward.
Yeah, I think related to the previous conversation, I would slightly adjust this and say essentially forward it or set your own, basically. If you're not EDE aware, then probably you should just forward it if you don't understand what it is. So if you are ED aware, if you'd like to have a code other than the one that was sent to you, replace it.
Didn't you just contradict yourself in your original statement? I'm confused.
No, what I'm saying is that we shouldn't grow a chain here where we extend and extend and extend.
Oh, so you don't like the trace route?
Right.
Okay, that agree. So 4.1 is actually okay, which is there's a question of whether we add a single source or not. So you're saying don't add a source at all,
right.
Just forward.
Either forward it intact or replace it.
Got it. Okay.
Andre, I see. So Wes, if you need a sentence to the draft, I would say the handling of EDE forwarding is not specified by this document and is implementation specific. And maybe like standardized later. It doesn't have to be experimental. It could be unspecified and say that it is implementation specific, and just deal with this until when we have more experience. So this is like 6, but not making the document experimental.
Well, actually, that's what the document says now. So I should have had a number 0, which is right now it says it is unspecified, but there was multiple people that thought that would not be useful. That is because, so trying to quote some of the people that brought this up, it's most likely a resolver that would get some of these errors, and they would want to know how to forward it to the client, because otherwise the resolver is going to do nothing but log the information, and it's not as helpful to the world if the end client and the end thing that started this whole chain doesn't get that chain of extra information. I'm sort of pseudo-quoting other people.
Hi, Mr. Bertola. I don't feel qualified to have really a technical opinion on the various options, but I would like to point out that conceptually, at least for the more application-oriented codes like the ones on filtering, there is the need for them to get forwarded throughout the entire chain, otherwise they are completely useless. So if there's a CPE doing forwarding, for example, there's the need for the codes to get forwarded then to the client, otherwise why do we have them? So I think 4.1 would work.
Okay, thank you.
Point of order, just to keep things moving, you had another issue you wanted to get to?
No.
Oh, okay, so this is...
So the other one's the source field and what we should put into the...
But you don't want to go into that now?
No, I'm waiting for this discussion to get done.
Okay.
How much time?
All right, you don't have unbounded time is what I'm telling you.
Sorry.
So I'm going to close the mic line for this section so you can get to the rest of your...
Okay.
The last issue you wanted to discuss.
Yeah, Ray Bellis, IC again. Sorry, just to pick on something Ben said. this goes back to what I was just saying about eDNS and hop by hop. Yeah, if you've got a folder in the path, it will already strip every eDNS option that comes back, because that eDNS options have no semantic meaning whatsoever, other than between the two parties that exchange those specific messages. So if I send a query to a forwarder, yeah, whatever eDNS options go out from there are up to the forwarder and have nothing to do with the client. Similarly, what comes back from the forwarder are irrelevant as far as the client's concerned. That's normal eDNS behavior, and that's why I have concerns about this whole idea of sending stuff back, because eDNS just doesn't work that way. It is exclusively for use between an individual client and the machine it's talking to.
So just to respond to that, I have no objection to that description. Personally, I've seen forwarders that are true NATs that do not inspect the DNS packets. So
yes, that's a specific edit I mentioned that's in 6J. Sorry, I can't remember the number now for the revised eDNS because of my previous work on 5625. If all you're doing is NAT forwarding, then there's an expectation. Yes, you can. You basically treat the DNS packet as almost if it's an opaque blob. So what goes out goes through the NAT, goes up to the upstream server, comes back again. But if you're in the DNS path, actually processing the DNS packet, then eDNS has no semantics through that forwarding path.
That makes sense to me.
Okay, thanks. Brian, last.
So I'm going to try and keep it short, but just sort of a heads up that people may want to have tomatoes ready to throw at me, because I'm going to suggest something, which is basically from a semantic perspective. I don't think forwarders that aren't EDE upgraded or have any other advanced features add any value. One of the things about the DNS traceroute concept would be to enable a client to learn what the actual resolver is as opposed to the forwarders and establish a direct connection. As far as I can think of, it really is only ever going to get the information coming from the resolver. So the fact that it goes through forwarders, if it's able to determine that there's no conflict in the addressing and it's able to directly reach the true resolver, if it can find its name somehow and address, which is the stuff I'm going to be working on in the other group, this may make most of this moot, I hope.
So there are a number of cases, if you go read through all of the current ones, where you might be getting it from an authoritative server, like an authoritative server will say, I'm lame, is one of the examples where should a resolver pass that back to the client? That's up to a resolver. So,
but that would be coming from the resolver, not a forwarder, if you can talk to the resolver.
If that would be up to the resolver whether to pass that information on to the client. I'd have to go read all of the examples in the document, but there's a few cases where you're getting it from an upstream.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, thanks.
Ben Schwartz. So for that case, I would suggest just defining codes that instead of forwarding a code that says I'm lame, define a code that says authoritative was lame.
Okay. How much time do we have? 3 minutes. 3 minutes. All right. So I'm probably okay. So if we add a source, and that remains to be determined, but if we went down we'll go back to the list and get some evaluation of other people at this point. It's interesting to see that the discussion has turned back around to sort of what the document says now in a lot of it, but that's okay. You have to explore all options and then come back. If we do want to add a source field, what do we put in it? And so the options that were sort of thrown out, and I mentioned some of them earlier, NSID would be one, hostname, fully qualified hostname. Remember that this would be added by the entity generating the option. So first off, an IP address, a URL, a IP:port, a cert subject name, right? There's lots of ways that a host might be identifying itself. After thinking about all this, NSID is actually very, very generic. It is a binary blob that should be printed via hex if you go read the NSID description, and it can accommodate anything. So the few of us that talked, NSID seems to be the right choice there because it can sort of subsume the rest of those. If anybody thinks that there is a better option, I would like to hear about it in 2 minutes.
Prefix the field with what kind of thing it is. So NSID : hostname or FQDN : whatever.
We thought about adding a type field too, but
yeah,
then it gets even more complex in managing that, and it seemed overly complex compared to NSIDs already exist to name things in the DNS space in terms of an identifier. So how much does that actually buy you? And it's not much.
Yep.
Okay.
So it sounds like you need to go assess what you've heard here and then either propose a revision or go back to the mailing list for further discussion, particularly on the forwarding options.
Yeah, I agreed. I think both options came up with a plethora of opinions that did not converge today into a single or two opinions. Yes.
Yeah. So go ahead and figure out what you think, and if there's further discussion, we can do it on the mailing list.
All right. Thank you all. That was actually helpful and not at the same time, but that's okay.
Thank you very much. And thanks everybody.
Yep. Thank you. Next, Ben Schwartz. Yeah, we're good in time. Yeah. Thank you. We have a lot to talk about, so I'll try to move fast here, and we can come back to the slides if there's something you want to talk about more. So SVCB is a draft that has been adopted by this working group. And the goal is that the client can do a query and get back a full set of information needed for connecting to a service. So in cases where you need more information, or at least would like more information than just the IP address before you initiate a connection, this can give you a whole bundle of information containing whatever it is that you need to know. It's also intended to solve some version of the CNAME at Apex problem. Possibly not the entire CNAME at Apex problem, but at least a big chunk of it. And in addition to SVCB itself, there is HTTPS SVC, which is an HTTPS specialized form that is intended for use with HTTPS. This is what we originally presented. So at IETF 105, we presented HTTPS SVC and got consistent or at least repeated feedback that people would like to see a solution that was less specifically bound to HTTPS. At the same time, we found that an HTTPS-specific RR type was valuable, and so we have both a generic solution and a specialization to HTTPS. And that's the form that this took at adoption. One of the things you can do with this record is to do multi-CDN hosting with encrypted SNI. This has been one of the trickiest challenges with encrypted SNI, where there are multiple IP addresses that could be associated with your domain name corresponding to different pools of servers operated by different parties. Those parties have different public keys, and so when you do your DNS queries, you need to get back an IP address and a public key, and it's fairly important that that IP address and public key are a matched pair. That's why you need to get them in a single query instead of in two separate queries, which potentially could give you the IP address of one CDN and then the public key of the other one. So that in presentation form, in a zone file, these records have two possible forms. One of them is called the alias form. It looks like this. It's a simple alias of a name. It's essentially only intended to be used at apexes. If you're not at the apex of a zone, you should probably use a CNAME. But when aliasing an apex, this can make that possible. And the other form is called service form. This is used by ESNI. In fact, it is now referenced. Well, it is now essentially a dependency of the encrypted SNI draft in the TLS working group. So this is the way that we expect to distribute ESNI public keys and other configuration options. But it also includes other attributes here, notably as shown in this example, you can indicate that the ALPN is H3, meaning that this is an HTTP3 capable server endpoint.
in which case the client can initiate its connection with quick instead of the status quo, where the only way to get to quick is to start with TLS over TCP and then get an in-band indication from the server that you should close your connection and try again, which is not very efficient and not very elegant. So there have been quite a few changes since IETF 105, most notably the generalization to SVCB, and this, importantly, a change in syntax. So if you look at the example in this slide, we have in red this key equals value syntax in the zone file that is no longer the HTTP alt service syntax, which is what the last presented version of this had. But those were before adoption, so hopefully people have seen this. Since adoption, there have been smaller changes, and I won't go through all of them. So there are two major remaining design questions in my view, although I would not at all be surprised if we discover some more in the course of implementations beginning and in the course of further reviews of the draft. One of them is related to reliability, fallback, and ESNI. So when building reliable services, it's very nice, it's very convenient if your clients have a fallback behavior where if they attempt a connection to one of the various options that exists and that attempt fails, their clients will retry down some sort of list. But with encrypted SNI, it's very important that your clients not fall back from an attempt that used encrypted SNI to an attempt that did not use encrypted SNI and thus revealed the thing that the server was trying to protect. So there is a tension here between reliability and security, and in particular, accidental misconfiguration. And the other issue that has come up is how to describe the alias chain length. So we have an alias type here, the alias form of this record, and that creates some sort of chain. So the question is, how many times, if you encounter an alias, how many times should you keep following aliases before you essentially give up in something like a loop detection? I want to point out, in case you haven't read the draft, that these aliases intermix freely with CNAME. So the question is not how to limit the number of total hops or total links in a forwarding chain. The question is, in a forwarding chain, which could potentially contain some mixture of these records and CNAMEs, how many of these alias form records should we allow in that chain? And do we need to enforce something like if you have an alias to a CNAME to an alias, is that allowed or not allowed? Things like that. There's one other question that I realized after making these slides that I think would be worth covering, and that's just to say that the current description of the required server behavior, or at least the recommended server behavior, which is section 4, really could use some review from server implementers, both authoritative and recursive. I think that we could use a little bit more specificity in describing exactly what additional records should be returned. So those are the substantive questions. There are also two purely bike shed questions that we need to deal with. One of them is about the presentation format. In a previous slide, I showed you this form with a 0 here. The presentation format is fairly flexible. If we want, we could get rid of this 0. Opinions welcome, I guess. And the other thing is what to name this thing. We have names, of course, that we've presented here. Nobody really likes these names. Nobody really hates these names. And we need to pin down names. I think I'll stop there for discussion.
All right, relaying for Mark Andrews. He says, stop working about chain length. Recursive servers already have limits for this. Keep the 0.
Okay.
Sorry, Ray Bellis, IC. The document talks about cooperating servers and saying they should look up the A records, quad A records, or whatever. Just from point of view of RR type allocation, with that level of conformance requirements, you may not be able to get early allocation through expert review. If it was a may, I think you'd be okay, but should is getting towards the point where it exceeds the expectations that an expert reviewer can go, because if there's required additional processing, then it has to go to a full IETF review. So.
Eric Orth, Chrome DNS. 2 comments. One on the chain length. Chrome is very sensitive to latency. This is in the critical path for loading web pages for however many users we have. And we just want to avoid unnecessary round trips as much as possible. So unless someone has real concrete use cases for why the chain length should be 8, we should be reducing that as much as possible to make it sure everyone agrees it's kosher for latency-sensitive clients like Chrome to stop doing the round trips as soon as it can, as soon as it becomes clear this is an unreasonable use case to try anymore. My other comment is I hate HBS service. I'm surprised I was able to say it in just one try there. It's very hard to say. I do not like it. Please come up with a better name.
Okay.
Alex Meyerhofer, Nick.at. I admit I haven't read the document, but a question came to my mind, that is, could that service that is being referred in that record also be the authoritative name server for a certain domain? So would, in theory, that record sort of like create an alternative delegation structure to a name server for a domain? And could that record, in that case, solve the problem of key discovery for an authoritative encrypted DNS server? It's just like thinking a little bit farther.
Sure. I think that you should probably talk to Tommy Pauly, who's behind you in line. It occurs to me that what you're describing sounds like a proposal that he has co-authored in some detail.
Okay.
Just a quick follow-up, I guess, from Mark Andrews relaying. He says, should is fine, it isn't must.
Okay. So then it sounds like we think we can go through. Was that related to the IESG review? I'm sorry, the expert review at IANA for early allocation?
I'll see if he answers again.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Alessandro Ghedini, Cloudflare. I have a clarification question. Going back to the alias form, is that the only form allowed on the root zone, on the root domain, or whatever?
No, alias form is not certainly not required.
Because so I find the example here and in the draft a bit confusing. It seems like if you have example.com, you have to have the alias to svc.example.whatever, and then in that actually put the proper HTTPS SVC record. But
Okay.
I guess that's not required.
Yes, the examples are mostly demonstrating the most complicated use case in order to exercise all of the features of the system in the examples. I think that your point is well taken. That
I have a pretty simple use case. I have a web server that supports both HTTP2 and HTTP3, and it does ESNI on both. So it would be nice to have an example for that as well.
So with ESNI in particular, one thing I'll say is, in general, ESNI makes the most sense when it is controlled by a CDN, and so
I am a CDN.
Okay, so then in that case, you might reasonably expect that you would like to be the one publishing your ESNI configuration, and you would not want your customers to be publishing your ESNI
we control both
configuration.
DNS and the HTTP.
I see. Yes. So in the case where the CDN customer domain is under the control of the same party that controls the ESNI keys, then there is no need for the alias form. That's certainly something that we could cover in an additional example.
Right. So that was the main use case for the ESNI DNS record as well. Like the CDN publishes it, and then there was the whole problem with like CNAMEs and whatever. But yeah.
Yes. So this this structure is compatible with all of those. All those.
Yeah, it's just like so. I found it somewhat confusing.
Okay.
The other thing is like from speaking for Cloudflare, we are interested in this. I can talk with the DNS authoritative server people and see like if they have comments about this, as well as the resolver people. I guess we have both.
I have two comments from Jabber. First one is from Ollie Van Hoya. SVCB sounds very good otherwise, but I'm worried about how long we need to have a fallback for clients that don't support aliasing with HTTP SSVC. Can I ever be certain that nobody needs an A record at Apex for Compat?
So I have an additional slide that might be relevant to that. I won't go through all the details here, but I think that's essentially right. Until some very hypothetical and distant time, we will not be able to rely on all clients implementing this. And so whatever you have to do today, you're still going to have to do that for some fraction of clients.
All right, and a second one from Peter Spacek. Expanding on chain limits, any latency would be introduced by site owner who also has insensitive not to do stupid things to his own site. Also, it would be hard to implement special chain lengths limits for just 2 RR types. Please keep the usual DNS behavior.
Brian Dixon, GoDaddy, plus 1,000 to what he just said. I would even go so far as to suggest in the metadata for this to say that it updates DNAME and CNAME and to make them all play well together. I don't see any reason not to.
In regard to the chain length?
Chain length, yes. It should support any arbitrary ordering and number of processes through the loop. It's footgun from the whoever owns the zone, whoever manages it. It's their own fault if they make it long and latent. They have the ability to fix it, but it should be a maximal flexibility.
Kazuhoku, firstly, regarding one of those issues, number 73, my understanding that ESNI has its own secure fallback mechanism that uses a ESNI retry ESNI retry message. So I don't think the DNS draft needs to deal with that. And regarding quick versus HTTP2, I agree that there's a footgun, but maybe you can just say that if you only publish quick HTTP3 records and then UDPs are unreachable, then it's the configuration's fault.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last few words.
Yeah, well, so my point is that ESNI is unrelated to this fallback problem. And regarding HTTP3 versus HTTP2 fallback, then I agree that if UDP is unreachable, then and if the server only publishes HTTP3 mapping, then it will be clear that there's a unreachability problem. So maybe you can just say that and leave it as is.
So just to explain that a little more, I guess the assumption here is that because there will always be, or because there will for a long time be clients who aren't implementing SVCB at all, you'll likely be able to fall back to a non-SVCB connection where you're just connecting on bare IP addresses, except if you have ESNI. If you started with ESNI, then that avenue of fallback is cut off. That's why these things interact.
Let's talk later. Thank you.
Favor Akama, I like to reiterate what all my fellow resolver vendor operators said. I mean, the CNAME chain problem really is solved. There's nothing to do, and there usually also is a caching of these kind of negative events when the change exceeds. So there is really not much latency that the stub resolver will get if there is a consistent problem for that. The other thing, the hints section, I looked at that text and maybe, I think I actually don't see the hints used anymore. Could I have misread that?
Yeah, so let's talk about the IP hints for a second. The IP hints have been a strong request from the encrypted SNI side, and they are really only used in a fairly narrow situation, which I've attempted to describe here.
Which I did not find. When are they used?
So they're used when the client is using a recursive resolver that is not aware of this new RR type. So that this draft does not have a mandatory requirement on recursives to add support. It has a should level recommendation.
There is no need for a recursive to understand that record. Recursive will transparently just give it to you.
So there isn't a need, but if the recursive is not aware, then the stub is forced to essentially do a chain walking exercise, walking through any indirection steps that are present if the recursive is operating under RFC 3597 unknown RR type behavior. Mm-hmm. In that case, there's potentially a substantial performance penalty for having to walk this chain to find the address records. And so in that particular case, the IP hints are designed to short circuit that process and allow clients to connect faster.
Okay, thanks. And the last question is, what is key 5 and key 0? It was just in the appendix, or in the, I think, 11 section 11.1, where you put all the different stuff and you describe it. You define key 0 and key 5, but I couldn't find any other instance of that in the document.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I will definitely take a look.
Tommy Pauly, Apple. So thanks for sharing this. We're very excited about trying to get implementation and testing now with it. With regards to the point earlier about early allocation and the requirements for that, I think it kind of also ties into, making sure that as we deploy this for experimentation and early deployments with ESNI and other features, that this kind of works gracefully when we have many recursives that aren't doing any special behavior for it. And I think the current status of this is, we essentially will have some cases that are maybe not optimal if the recursives don't know about it, but we have workarounds. So I just want to make sure that we focus on that, and if there are any things that we should tweak in the text to make sure that it's possible to get that early allocation, start doing that experimentation, that we kind of do those changes as necessary. Also, I wanted to check, have we asked for early allocation officially yet?
Not yet. Among other things, it requires us to finalize our names and probably also the presentation.
Okay, so this makes the bike shed very important?
Well, it makes closing the bike shed very important.
Yes.
I'm not encouraging anybody to jump in necessarily.
Okay. So I guess, what is the time frame for this, and what is the manner in which we want to paint our bike shed?
So given that so far I've heard reluctance to engage, which I appreciate.
Yes.
I think the editors will try to decide on some final names, which might just be current names, and send them to the list for essentially final comments before we freeze it.
What's the yeah? Please do.
Sorry, my comments earlier with my expert review hat on. So you need basically a fully stable specification before you can get early allocation, because implementers will actually implement at that point. So the presentation format needs to be fixed. The wire format needs to be completely fixed.
Yes.
I just had checked with one of my other reviewers. We are still of the opinion that if it says may, so that it's truly optional processing, you'll be okay for expert review. But if you say should, that's too strong a requirement.
to clarify on that point, would it be okay to say may and then potentially have that change by the time it becomes an RFC to a should?
All right.
No. Okay.
We nominally have about 10 minutes left in the session, and we've got quite a long mic line here.
Okay.
So
Sounds
nobody
good.
should feel
All right.
hurried, but let's keep it moving. The
I'll send
specifics of
email
the
suggestions
specifics of
about
the
bike check.
allocation we can take up on the mailing list when everybody's had a chance to talk to, make sure we understand all the requirements. Thanks.
Rolf Wilmans, NL Labs. So those alias records now can point to the SVC records, the A records, and quad A records, right? Which means that if you start walking the chain, if you do the additional processing, you have to send out 3 queries for every alias you get.
That's correct. If you see an if you see an alias record as a recursive, you have to fire 3 queries. If you don't, and essentially pass it to the client, essentially you don't implement the should strength recommendation, then the client will instead have to issue at least 2, probably 3 queries.
But as resolver, it also means that if you have to wait till you get the answer for your SVC query, right? Only then you know if you want to use that one or the A and quad A records. Which also means that if that new record type is blocked somewhere, you can't start using those A and quad A records.
I'm sorry, if a new record type...
If there are some upstream, if there's something on the path that does weird things with unknown record types, then you stop resolving.
Yeah, that's potentially a very serious concern. One of the questions I have is there, have you seen significant problems with unknown with ability to transfer unknown RR types between recursives and authoritatives?
Yes. Would it be possible to indicate in the alias records whether it's pointing to a other SVC type or not? Because then the problem is basically solved. Then you only have to send 1 query. Then you send it to a name server where you know they support it.
That's certainly an interesting idea. I would have to think more about it, maybe. The one thing I would say is it creates an operational tie between the alias source and target. And so it's a little bit unpleasant for that reason. If a CDN changes its configuration, you wouldn't want to have to tell all the customers that they also have to change their configuration.
Andre, I see. So I'm so happy that we are finally abandoning the A name and moving the problem where it should have been from the beginning. So from the implementer's perspective, I see no problem there, and I'm even willing to buy the bullet and implement the IP hints if it helps you to move from the A name to whatever you name it in the end and implement it in the clients where it should have been from the beginning. Thank you.
Relaying for Dan York, have developers of clients expressed interest in implementing SVCB or HTTP SVC? Do we have people out there who are excited to implement this? I think Apple stated this earlier. Okay. So if there are clients being excited to implement this, that's what Dan was saying.
Eric Orth, Chrome DNS, yes, we're excited to implement this.
All right. And then I have 2 other comments from Mark Andrews. He says, add a sunset date for not using record at Apex. And secondly, wire formats need to be stable for early allocation.
Yeah, as far as the early allocation, we'll make sure that, we'll work with Diana. That's, frankly, that's part of the chair's job is to make sure that the request is fully cooked before we go to Diana with it.
David Skenazy, Google Chrome. Yeah, Eric answered what I was going to say. Yes, Google Chrome is very interested in this. Let's make it happen. So have the editors pick a color for the bike shed. We really don't care. Just make it happen so we can move forward.
Can you move forward a slide? Oh, sorry. So the different forms other than the alias, those are those are needed in certain cases to be able to say there's more than one kind of thing. Doesn't need to have an ESNI config.
No, so SVCB in general is protocol independent, and it contains essentially an arbitrary key value store. This HTTP SSVC is HTTP specific, and the only mandatory key is ALPN.
Okay, cool. So I'm sure that Brian Dixon for GoDaddy that we're very interested in implementing at least the 0 case, as well as possibly a limited amount of these other more advanced forms as soon as it stabilizes, and maybe some kind of label that starts with an H. How about hue, H-U-E? That's a generic term for a bike shed color.
Okay, we would like to make progress as fast as we can, of course, on this draft. In particular, this draft is blocking certain, is one of the things that blocks widespread deployment of ESNI. So there's a certain amount of pressure to move forward on this, but it also sounds like we should be able to make good progress. I want to especially thank people who've started prototyping, and I look forward to the feedback from the prototyping.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for the room, for the good discussions and input. We also want to thank Willem for his flexibility. So the presentation on the DNS cookies will be bumped and moved to Thursday. We have sufficient room. Good. So please continue also this discussion on the mailing list.
Anybody who didn't sign a blue sheet?
Yeah, and blue sheets. For the, so we already heard some, kind of commitments on the mic for early implementations from different organizations. We're quite happy with that. So, and also before working last call, we would like to see a number of implementations of, or prototype proof of concept implementations of the draft. Okay. Then we want,
Thanks, everybody, and see you all Thursday. Thanks so much. All right.
Yeah. All right.
Didn't know I was.
Yeah. Wes has a good camera.
Tim doesn't like his picture too.
Thanks.
I know I didn't. I sort of got my Hello. All right, I will take the blue sheets because.
Yeah. You need to.